Okay, hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the second in a two-part series on fascisms. My name is Christine Hong. I'm faculty and the director of Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at UC Santa Cruz, and along with Neda Tanasowski, I co-direct a new Center for Racial Justice, and we are both also the third generation of co-editors of the Journal of Critical Ethnic Studies. And I wanted to say just a few things about both the Center for Racial Justice and the journal. So the Center for Racial Justice is linked to the program in critical race and ethnic studies. And as some of you may know, ethnic studies was very late in emerging on the UC Santa Cruz scene. And this is despite there being 4+ decades of student activism. So at the same time that students at SF State and UC Berkeley were fighting for a third world college. At that same window of time, there were students at UC Cruz who were also calling for ethnic studies, but our program did not emerge until 2014. And as Neda, as the former director of CREZ, and I can attest, our efforts within CREZ have been consumed since our emergence several years ago by the business, the everyday grinding business of survival, of mounting our core curriculum, of ensuring that we have sufficient faculty lines to teach our curriculum. And a question that emerged within the space of CREZ, which gave rise to the Center for Racial Justice, was how could we enable not just cross-divisional conversations about racial justice on this campus, but also foster a much needed space for the engagement of racial justice at multiple scales. And so in keeping with awareness that ethnic studies derives its mandate from community-based struggles and has at its core political education, and to create dynamic possibilities for activist scholarly exchange, we submitted a proposal for the Center for Racial Justice, which is just now entering its second year. And we are so pleased to be one of the co-sponsors of this series on fascisms. I want to say another thing too about the Journal of Critical Ethnic Studies. As I was mentioning, Neda and I are the third generation of co-editors, and we're following most immediately on the heels of Wayne Yang and Eve Tuck. And we are in a very time-consuming, labor-intensive process of transitioning the journal fully online. This is going to be open access, and this is in the interest of the broadest success. And in thinking through the legacy of ethnic studies, critical ethnic studies, or ethnic studies as a critical project, Neda and I really wanted to return this journal to emphasis on political education. And so we decided that in addition to traditional academic essays, the journal would feature an activist interview, a curated political educational document that could be retaught and animated in settings, both academic and activist, a work in translation or a work from or about the Global South, an individually or collectively authored syllabus around urgent areas of concern, emergent significance, or under theorization in the field, as well as an interactive forum, a kind of conversation organized around a recent key work. This could be a book, a film, some other type of media object within the field, and then have also the creator's response to that discussion. And so when we were meeting as a board, we had a conversation with two of our board members who brought this forward, Alyosha Goldstein and Simon Ventura Trujillo, about the possibility of urgent issues organized around topical areas that are pressing immediate concern. And we were talking about fascisms, and they developed a very interesting, very powerful series that reflects not in an exceptional way on this time that looks at what's happening right now and also casts back to past histories of anti-fascist struggles. And the longer bios for all of the panelists, as well as the coordinators of this series, are online. But I'll say for right now that Alyosha is Professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. He is the author of Poverty in Common, The Politics of Community Action During the American Century. He's also the editor of many deeply important volumes and special journal issues of politically engaged scholarship. Simon is an assistant professor of Latinx studies in the Department of English at NYU. His first book is titled Land Uprising, Native Story Power and the Insurgent Horizons of Latinx Indigeneity. And I will yield the floor.
Gotta unmute. There we go. So I just want to start by thanking Christine, Netta, Trung Nguyen, Taylor Ansley, Lisa Supple, and Tony Boardman for hosting this week's and last week's panel as well. And I also want to thank everyone for joining us today during this really, I would say, unnerving moment where we're kind of suspended between what Nikhil Singh described as these kind of electoral choices between panic and despair, that we're really in a moment that is not exceptional, but is in many ways indicative of this sort of empire in decline that is the United States. And sort of the kind of brutality that emerges within it, what Gramsci called the morbid symptoms, as the sort of constitutive investment in what Manu Karuka calls as shareholder whiteness. We see all this kind of pronounced tension at this particular moment. So I want to thank you all for joining us as we're sort of waiting for these electoral decisions to be made, but also just to keep in mind that it's really these deeper conditions of this empire itself that is the sort of, and the social movement struggle against those conditions that I think we need to keep most focused on. So this week's panel and last week's bring together speakers, as Christine was saying, from the Critical Ethnic Studies issue on fascisms that Simone Trujillo and I are editing, and that will be out next spring. We wanted to be sure to have a more sort of immediate forum for our speakers, for our contributors, to that issue to speak about what they're working on. That's what these two panels are. They're folks among the contributors to the special issue going to be talking about the papers that they're working on. And before I hand over the kind of introduction to today's specific panel from Simone, I wanted just to say a little bit briefly about the issue itself. So our intention with the Critical Ethnic Studies issue has been to consider the formations of fascism in the plural as entangled with the vectors of imperialism, colonialism, and racism in various ways across time and place. Last week, Johanna Fernandez noted that fascism is a historically specific response to crises of capital accumulation and imperialist formation that works to mobilize racism and xenophobia in particular ways. And so our focus in the issue is to kind of bring to the fore that broader kind of horizon to think about the way in which the analytic of fascism can be addressed both to European and American colonialism, but also really to think about, Amy Césaire spoke about the sort of barbarism that that colonialism brought back to Europe and kind of became the foundation of fascism. I think we want to also think about what it means in places where imperial and sort of colonial circumstances are conditions and practices where those remain, right? Where there is no returning to, but those sort of ongoing circumstances of colonial fascism persist. So throughout the issue, we're trying to draw attention to highlight the ways in which Black, Indigenous, and people of color organizing against imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, and white supremacy have really sought to make certain kind of connections to fascism or the kind of forms of militarism, the kinds of vigilantism that they confront in the conditions of colonialism, capitalism, imperialism. So we hope that you will look at the issue when it comes out in the spring. And in the meantime, I'm very grateful to our contributors who are with us here today, 3 of whom are with us today to speak about what they're working on. So I'll now hand things over to Simone to give a specific introduction to the panel today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alyosha, and thank you all for joining us. It's an unprecedented time, but one that has a certain has been telegraphed in certain ways. So today's panel is on the topic of fascism and regimes of knowledge, and it's a kind of follow-up panel to our opening panel on fascism and organized violence. And one of the things we're trying to really do with this panel really is really trying to elucidate the epistemological challenges that fascism brings to bear upon critical intellectual practice. And so I think we're interested in the relation between fascism and knowledge production in a few ways. I think one, we're working to think about the ways that fascist formations represent a dire threat to critical intellectual practice. And then, the threat isn't only to professionalize academic regimes of knowledge, but also thinking about knowledge as it is enacted in activist and artistic encounters, those encounters and community encounters that produce organic and subjugated knowledges for survival. And so in another way, I think we're also thinking about fascism that while it is fanatically anti-intellectual and reactionary, we are also interested in exploring how fascisms require regimes of knowledge that stem from epistemologies, aesthetics, and juridical structures that underpin colonial racism. So we know, for example, that Nazi jurists and scholars produced an array of studies on the racist statutes embedded in US federal and state laws, and that was highly influential to the erectment of the Third Reich. So there's this question of the ways in which fascisms also proliferate a certain regime of study, a certain regime of knowing, that one that's kind of also entangled in cross-colonial politics of knowledge. And in another level, there is the challenge that was really kind of raised in our first panel, which is the challenge of mapping and periodizing the phenomenon of fascism, especially when we suspend the Eurocentric framings that have prevailed in its study. And so this challenge really asks us to reckon with the ways in which the appearance of fascism calls into question the continuities and the ruptures between feudalism, imperialism, colonialism, and liberalism, between the ascendance of capital and capitalism and its degeneration, between aesthetics and politics, and even between terror and freedom, right? So there's a kind of profound kind of cognitive dissonance that working on fascism brings forth. And so I think we're really trying to not necessarily settle that, but really kind of think about what's at stake and engaging it in our contemporary moment. And so one of the things that we wanted to do with this panel is we asked all of our panelists to consider 3 questions as part of their presentations for today. And I'll go ahead and read the questions aloud. So the first question is, what might the analytic of fascism offer or obscure for understanding the present authoritarian convergence? In what ways might the focus of our contributor-specific essays ask us to rethink the significance or historical and political dynamics of this convergence? And what broader horizons or relations of anti-imperialist, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist struggle are at stake in the presentations and in the contributions? So these are the questions that our panelists will be responding to in relationship to their own specific curiosities and investments. And so I want to just say a quick note on the format of the presentation. So each panelist will speak for 10 minutes. We will then give panelists time to respond to one another. And then we'll take questions from the audience. And I'll just kindly ask you to type your questions in the Q&A function, and Alyosha and I will be moderating those questions. So what I'd like to do is to introduce our panelists. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, Denise Ferreira da Silva, is unable to make it to tonight's convening. But we are still lucky to have an amazing lineup of powerhouse intellectuals. And so I want to begin by introducing Nadia Boulhaj, who is professor in the departments of anthropology at Barnard College and Columbia University, and the co-director of the Center for Palestinian Studies at Columbia. She is the author of Facts on the Ground, Archaeological Practice and Territorial Self-Fashioning in Israeli Society, and The Genealogical Science, The Search for Jewish Origins and the Politics of Epistemology. Her third book, tentatively titled Soldier Trauma, The Obligations of Citizenship and the Forever Wars, examines the field of military psychiatry and explores the complex ethical and political implications of shifting psychiatric and public understandings of the trauma of American soldiers. Followed by Nadia, we'll have Macarena Gomez-Bariz, who is professor and chairperson of the Social Science and Cultural Studies at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. She is also director of the Global South Center, a research center that works at the intersection of social ecologies, art/politics, and decolonial methodologies. She is the author of Where Memory Dwells, Culture and State Violence in Chile. She's the co-editor with Herman Gray of Towards a Sociology of the Trace, and also of The Extractive Zone, Social Ecologies and Decolonial Perspectives. And her latest publication is Beyond the Pink Tide, Art and Politics in the Americas. And then following Macarena will be Cynthia A. Young, who is an associate professor of African American Studies, English, and Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Penn State University, where she is also the department head of African American Studies. She is the author of Soul Power, Culture, Radicalism, and the Making of a U.S. Third World Left. Her current manuscript, Terror Wars, Culture Wars, Race, Popular Culture, and the Civil Rights Legacy After 9/11, considers the contours of popular culture and contemporary discourse in the wake of the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Sorry. Okay, hi. So I'm going to begin this session today. I want to begin by thanking everyone who was involved in organizing it, quite centrally Alyosha and Simone, and of course Christina and Neda and everyone else who put together the logistics. It's an honor to be invited to do this. We shall see. I'm not sure I'm going to quite manage the questions, but I'm going to give some very preliminary thoughts really about perhaps less knowledge production and fascism or ultra-right-wing politics today, but the question of knowledge itself. So I will begin. In my comments today, I'm going to focus on the problem of knowledge and its relationship to the various forms of ultra-right-wing nationalisms gaining ground. In short, as we confront a public domain saturated with talk of fake news, and as scholars and journalists write about what it might mean to be or to live in a post-truth society, I want to suggest something a little different with regard to the relationship between what we might think of about as authoritarian or authoritarian-esque racial democracies, and I'm going to come back to why the democracy later, that seem to be leaning in hard towards some reconfiguration of fascism, or at least some of its constitutive elements, and the status of facts or truth in politics. This very preliminary thinking comes from my work in two domains, first on US militarism and the so-called forever wars, and second on the struggle over history in Israel and Palestine. I'll begin with a few comments born of the first domain. In thinking about what it means to say that the American public is and has been barely engaged at all, or even aware of the post 9/11 wars, which of course are not over, I've struggled with what that detachment is or indicates and how it manifests. And I've thought about that in part by thinking with and in contrast to Joseph Masco's work on state secrecy, and he elaborates this in his book, The Theater of Operation. After 9/11, Joe Masco argued the US state reclassified many Cold War documents that had been previously classified, some of which are in fact available in the public domain. What work does the secrecy do, Masco asks. He writes, and I quote, Durkheim discovers not only that removing something from public view endows it with social power, but also that the object of secrecy, its information, is often less important, than the organizational approach to managing it, unquote. He then explains, quote, and this is referring to the US contemporary state, the national security state system of compartmentalized secrecy produces a world in which knowledge is always rendered suspect, unquote. Masco's analysis provides insights into our political present, of course, although in ways perhaps he could not quite predict. If it is the authority of the expert, and in fact of the expert with security clearance, who renders public knowledge suspect in Masco's account. Today, a deep suspicion of experts and intellectual elites is a rather powerful means through which knowledge is being undermined. Nevertheless, if one wants to think about authoritarianism, one of its main components for political scientists and theorists alike has been the state's control over information. That is, state secrecy combined with censorship and sustained and organized propaganda. In fact, I remember being in Iraq during the late years of its war with Iran, and every night on the news and in every newspaper account, all Iraqi soldiers always returned from the front unharmed. Authoritarian regimes do not necessarily care or even demand that citizens believe what they are told, as Lisa Wedeen has argued. The regime only demands that they speak and act as if they did. And that, of course, stands in contrast to Hannah Arendt's account of totalitarian regimes, in which she argued there was nothing but mere propaganda. Which referred to that as its language games, right? The vulnerability of factual truths was on full display under the Nazi regime for Arendt. And the failure of the prosecutors and judges at Eichmann's trial to recognize that he was not just lying was a sign of their own incapacity to understand a constitutive aspect of fascist power. Now, the specific ways in which such analyses may need to be rethought in relation to the political present in the US and in Israel, although not precisely the same way, is far beyond the scope of my comments. Instead, I want to ask, what else might be going on? What if secrecy, organized lying, the ever proliferating rabbit holes produced by getting one's news only via one's own Facebook feed, group or Twitter feeds, or for that matter from Fox News? What if none of that can account adequately for various political phenomena we might seek to understand? To return to the US public's presumed disengagement from and ignorance about the wars, I might ask, despite all the classification and despite all the state and military secrets, does the American public not know enough? For example, that the Iraq War was started on a lie? Does it not know enough about the harms being perpetrated against civilians in Iraq, Afghanistan, and everywhere else on whom the US is unleashing lethal force? If those are secrets, then they are clearly secrets living in plain sight or hiding in plain sight. What do we do with that? And moreover, as you will see, what if they're not secrets at all? So I'm going to take a detour through Israel and Palestine and a specific historical and, of course, urgent political question. What did happen in 1948? The Nakba, the expulsion of 700,000 Palestinians from their villages and cities during the 1948 war, was widely dismissed not only in Israeli society, but in the Euro-American world for decades following 1940. The land had been empty. There was no such thing as a Palestinian. The Arab regimes had tricked the Arab inhabitants of the land into fleeing. The forms of denial were endless. But with the Israeli state's declassification in 1978 of its own official documents pertaining to Israel's so-called War of Independence, Israeli historians gained access to previously unavailable documents, and a few began to rewrite the history of their state. They challenged hegemonic narratives regarding the founding of the Israeli state. Most fundamentally, historians such as Benny Morris and Ilan Pappé demonstrated that Palestinians were in fact driven out, expelled by Zionist military forces during the war. There were disagreements among these so-called new historians and on the part of Palestinian scholars who challenged them. Was the expulsion intentional, pre-planned, essential to the Jewish state? Was it an event that unfolded during the chaos or fog of war? Nevertheless, the basic parameters of that new history became widely accepted in the Israeli Academy and even in the Israeli public domain, and one could say even in the US, at least in liberal circles. During its War of Independence, so-called, Zionist military brigades expelled the vast majority of Palestinian population so that the Jewish state could be established and its borders expanded. So jump forward circa 20 years. Beginning in the early years of the new millennium, teams were sent by the secretive security department of Israel's defense ministry. They were sent to pore through documents in the Israeli archives to remove them from public view. Previously declassified documents were resealed into vaults of state security, and mostly documents having to do with the Nakba. In fact, the main document on the basis of which Benny Morris published his seminal 1986 essay, quote, that was called The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, 1947 to 1949, that main document was disappeared. A Haaretz, which is the sort of main intellectual liberal paper in Israel, Haaretz reports the former head of the Defense Ministry's Security Department about the logic of reclassifying a document whose content was so widely known. The former official responded, I quote, if he, as in Morris, if Morris quoted from it and the document itself was not there, i.e. where Morris said it was, then his facts aren't strong. If he says, yes, I have the document, I can't argue with that. There's a difference of day and night in terms of the validity of the evidence, unquote. While Morris himself thought the reclassification of the document was ridiculous, it was not in defense of the document's possible political significance in the present. By the early 2000s, Morris himself had transformed from a reluctant post-Zionist to a staunch defender of the War of 1948. All nations are founded in violence. Israel is no exception. It had to be done, he declared. If there was a problem, it was that Ben-Gurion hadn't finished the job. Now, several years after Morris's recantation of post-Zionism, a prominent left-leaning Israeli columnist published a book titled My Promised Land, which is the author's reckoning with the violence against Palestinians on which his homeland was built. Ali Shavit's account rotates around an event in Lidda, a massacre of Palestinians who had hidden the mosque, who had gone to the mosque to hide from the Zionist brigades. In Shavit's narrative, Lidda stands for a tragic inevitability that was not recognized by the Jewish settlers until it was too late. Basically, if Lidda was, I'm quoting, Zionism could not be. With the massacre in Lidda, Zionism lost its innocence. But even as Shavit chooses to focus on Lidda because of the massacre, that act of extreme violence is not really his point. His point is the massacre might have been avoidable, but its conditions of possibility, that were not. Quote, he says, I'm quoting, do I turn my back on the Jewish national movement that carried out the deed of Lidda? He asks rhetorically. The choice is stark, he answers. Either reject Lidda, Zionism because of Lidda, or accept Zionism along with Lidda. Lidda was a town in central Palestine, by the way. And Shavit tells us his choice is to, quote, stand by the damned. So what is the point of this detour through Israel-Palestine and the facts and meaning of the Nakba? I guess I want to trouble at least a little bit a few possible ways of framing the current struggle against the increasing power and reach of ultra-right nationalisms. That what stands center stage is the need to counter fake news, conspiracy theories, and organized lying. That recuperating some semblance of truth, even if few of us believe wholesale in the category of objectivity, recuperating some semblance of truth will have politically salutary effects, be that by reading against or along the archival grain, or just simply trying to combat Fox News, and the rabbit holes of the internet. Clearly, I have no intention of dismissing such efforts, but I do want to suggest something else and more on which we also need to focus. In deciding to reclassify so many of the documents that tell the story of 1948, the Israeli state may have been a little too worried or frightened by the power of facts. To rely on a distinction made by the philosopher Stanley Cavell, knowing is not the same as acknowledging. The stories that the declassified and now partially reclassified documents tell are widely known today. By and large, they are accepted among the Israeli Jewish public and by the American liberal establishment that so enthusiastically embraced Shavit's book as a liberal ethical reckoning with his own state. but those facts are not acknowledged. That is, they do not emerge as matters of public concern and action. The story of Libya demonstrates that Israel was founded on the violence of conquest and expulsion, and insists at one and the same time that there was no other choice. In other words, in its current configuration of power, as distinct from the configuration from the 1940s through at least the early to mid 1990s, Israeli settler nationhood no longer depends on the suppression of that truth. Instead, it operates through the embrace of a far more brazen and explicit seizure of power. Yes, the Nakba, and no, we Israelis don't care. I'm almost done. That is a phenomenon we might want to consider in the US as well. This is not a state characterized by, quote, an authoritarian univocality, to borrow Lisa Rudin's term. Whatever its authoritarian and fascistic impulses, whatever the authoritarian and fascistic impulses in the present moment, they are grounded in and empowered by the consent and commitment of a large population, of a large portion of the American public. And that public may well know enough that children are being put in cages and deported to Mexico, even if they are not Mexican, that over 250,000 of their fellow citizens have died of COVID, including increasingly some of their own friends and neighbors. And yet they just don't care. Those are not matters that rise to the level of public concern and action, at least not for them. The struggle then over acknowledgement, that is, over what and who consider worthy of attention or recognition, or who should have rights, and quite centrally voting rights, and who of care may turn out to be an even harder battle to wage. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to share screen. So as we've started the panel, it's gotten darker over here. I'm fidgeting a little bit with the lights along the East River here in Brooklyn. I want to thank Aloysia and Simon so much, and also the Center for Racial Justice at UC Santa Cruz for that important work. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm really excited to be here. It's an honor. It's a hard day as well. One of the main aims of fascism as a monocultural formation is really to dull thought and to concentrate the sensorium. And I feel that we're all in this tunnel vision today of kind of blurring scenarios and magic maps, and this reduction of a vast political differences and forms of living and being into this narrow binary between red and blue states and narrow victories. So even if there is a kind of Biden win, and it appears more likely, we know it's contested, and there are also many worrisome features of this election, many worrisome features, troubling features, including the election of 25-year-old Madison Cawthorn in North Carolina, who's known to be a white supremacist and who posted in 2017 about his trip to Adolf Hitler's Eagle's Nest and declared his Nazi sympathies. And so then the work of so many today, even some of our faculty at Pratt Institute, of having to attend Protect the Vote rallies. So just to say all of that as a kind of first moment that we're right to be frightened, we're right to be sickened, and also maybe even critically hopeful, to use the term that Brazilian radical pedagogue Paulo Freire gave us, for a kind of hope that is instantiated both in material realities and in utopic desires beyond this immediate moment. So in my own contribution to the issue, I begin by stating that the global reach of authoritarianism has meant that those of us who think with the tools of critical ethnic studies have been forced to reflect again on its planetary expansion, as well as its historical condition, and specifically its anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, homophobic, religious fundamentalist, xenophobic, and anthropogenic character. And we also have to insist on how authoritarian power, and these are some of the comments that we heard from Aloysia at the beginning, not only undergirds the modern market economy, but also has this persistent colonial racial global order underneath. And though it feels like it, to also note, we are not in a time of exception, even if we are in a state of dire planetary urgency that requires the death of Western ontology. And this is the image of the death of Western ontology that's used here by Mapuche filmmaker Francisco Huecheaqueo, where he uses a format of surrealism to break with European representation, specifically reworking the pre-Raphaelite figure of Ophelia to represent the colonial impact upon a climate crisis world. Since I was a graduate student in sociology at UC Santa Cruz, I pursued the ghosts of dictatorship neoliberalism fed off of and embedded within it. This was a process of blanqueo, the whitening that took place in the aftermath of the brutal police and military forces in South America that did the work of extractive capitalism, neoliberalism, birthing it by bringing to power fascist dictators like Pinochet, and also a paradigm of war, as Nelson Maldonado Torres describes it, that turned leftist political sympathizers into criminalized political dissidents. In Central America, the US-backed imperial wars propping fascist dictators lasted well into the late 1990s with all kinds of reverberations today. And reflecting on that work as I do in this essay, I can see that despite persistent calls for abolition by guerrilla liberation forces and the careful work of transversal social movements in the Americas, and much more broadly in the decolonizing work, in fact, it has always been the police and military apparatus that tried to quell national independence, but also presided over transitions to democracy. The legacies of torture regimes, militarized police, and the disappearances and such have given rise in part of the legacies to the triptych convergence of ecocide, genocide, and feminicide over the past decades. Lenca activist Berta Cáceres, pictured here and pointing to the disappearing rivers of imperial extractive wars in Honduras, paid the price of her own life at the hands of 6 militia in 2016, as have dozens of others. As Black, Indigenous, and decolonial scholars and lived experiences have shown, the questions of authoritarianism and liberal democracy often share a symbiotic relationship, especially given that the racial state deploys differential brutality to secure private property, high consumer debt ratios, and ratifying impossibly skewed concentrations of wealth, while continually repressing potential opposition. These current forms of authoritarianism not only find their genealogy in something like the Nazi regimes of Europe at the turn of the 20th century, again to echo the opening points, but also deeper authoritarian tentacles that reach into the establishment of Republican settler nation states through laws like the liquidation and elimination of indigenous peoples in South America that literally legally dispossessed by sending in troops and military forces. And this ghostly sepia tone image of women and children is one of land dispossession by a military occupation that represents an archival trace of that 19th century legacy. So the obvious first point then is to establish this longue durée of the colonial police and military forces as foundational to the authoritarian racial nation state. The less obvious next question is to ask what is new then about this particular global political economic formation, a global idea of race, to reference Denise Freire da Silva, that differently expels, criminalizes, imprisons, extracts, disenfranchises, maims, and kills to accumulate as a means to drive capitalist growth. As we know, Trumpian forms of proto-ethno-nationalism may be vile, but they're not unique. And in fact, they're duplicated in the governance styles of Piñero, Valsonero, Modi, and Duterte regimes where elected dictators learn from each other, and they do the work of strong-arming liberal democratic states. In a regressive autopoiesis or a closed self-induced tautology, autocrats campaign on security concerns that capitalism first produces and then distribute false pretenses rather than redistribute their own obscene profit margins. They cynically address those whose access to liberal rights they dismantled with the promised goodies of liberal equality and inclusion. So, although the term authoritarian capitalism has been kept in reserve for a few global states, South states, as if it happens there and not in the global north or for China, I'm interested in using it now to encapsulate new and constitutive features of this transitional, if consolidating, planetary political and economic formation that's organized through disaster, surveillance, extractive, and racial forms of capitalism. In the words of Jamil Kadir, professor of English literature at Bethlehem University in Palestine, quote, Trump's objection to outsourcing rejection of free trade treaties and his call for more government economic intervention are all symptoms of the fact that neoliberal economic policies and the democratic values associated with them can no longer drive capitalist growth. As a result, the crisis of global capitalism today is driving nations worldwide toward a new form of political economic organization, namely authoritarian capitalism. We might read the ghostly trace of neoliberalism as already in its last gasp, and new consolidations of racialized global capital in motion, producing not only forms of authoritarian capitalism, but also where authoritarianism and fascism are embedded within institutions of liberal democracy, where the sanctioning of billionaires like Piñera and Trump buy, steal, and mediatize their way to legitimated political victories. If neoliberalism is ending, has ended, and we are moving to authoritarian capitalism, then what are the ways that this new old formation begs for a decolonial, a queer of color, a trans-asterisk feminist critique of this fascist and decaying, and this is aspirational, last stage of capitalism? After neoliberalism, what must be burned to the ground in order to build anew? And this is a question that I'm trying to pose, and I don't necessarily answer it all in this essay, but I think it's part of how we have to kind of think about this critique at this time. And in part, to answer what needs to be burned to the ground, I want to turn in the remaining few minutes to the recent effort to rewrite national constitutions, perhaps like Wichageo's floating Ophelia, to dismantle from within a system of governments that's inherently steeped in the colonial racial order. Constitutions are perhaps a strange object of popular reform, given that they're that they are the instrument of racialization, but this is precisely why they have been the topic of recent political horizons in the Americas. As we know, Bolivia's deposed Aymara indigenous president Evo Morales worked in tandem with constituent assemblies to transform the Bolivian Criollo racist constitution into the plurinational constitution. And the plurinational constitution redressed indigenous exclusion and provided territorial rights of sovereignty as well as earth rights, even as corporate capitalism continued to facilitate new extractive corridors and contract mineral rights, etc. We also know that gender and sex rights are often absented from the rewriting process, as Mujeres Creando outlines in the feminist rewriting of the plurinationalist constitution. So sometimes these are ongoing projects of revision and rewriting, but hey, we know how to do that. We're constantly revising. It's also not a minor point to suggest that pink tide governments and their constituencies had already turned away from neoliberalism in the Washington Consensus in the 1990s, anticipating the social failures and the ultimate rupturing point of neoliberal capitalism. More recently, on October 25th, the referendum that won the popular vote to rewrite the Constitution was an effort to undo a market-driven authoritarian revision of the Constitution. So Pinochet's 1980 Constitution enshrined the free market economic model as the law of the land. And much like the various ballot measures in different parts of the United States, it worked to privatize education, healthcare, Social Security, as well as criminalizing indigenous Mapuche life by deploying anti-terrorist legislation. And this is something we've seen everywhere, by the way, right? The strategic use by authoritarian or fascist states of anti-terrorist legislation to target Black and Indigenous peoples and anti-extractive organizing. So I want to end on the note that in the depressing kind of political climate of illiberal democracy and rising neo-fascism, we can look to beyond the kind of individual personality traits of the authoritarian character to focus instead on its structural and political dimensions, and even more importantly, to highlight new forms of capital accumulation that are at the core of current global operations of racial governance. On the day after the US election, a week after the Chilean referendum, we also might go back to the indigenous Mapuche call for indigenous sovereignty and specific proposals like Escucha Winca, Listen White Man, the proposal written by indigenous community historians that demands plurinational shared governance, like calls as well from the Black diaspora. The time for horizontal redress is now, and in order to remake from the ash in this impossibly violent vertical world, we might point the finger directly at the state as the perpetrator, as the transfeminist La Tesis Collective has in this image, and not let them off the hook. Thank you for listening.
So I want to thank, again, everyone for being here, and for to Alyosha and Simone for inviting me. It's been a roller coaster of a day, and right before this, I was in a meeting with community members from my department and from the university, and we're in central Pennsylvania. So we're right in the thick of Trump country. And it was an interesting discussion because we were talking about things that resonate very much with what I want to talk about today, and that is the kind of knowledge that the people who live next door to you, or the people who pump your gas, or the people who are in the grocery store, are also people who sanction the eradication of you or people that you care about. And so we kind of sat with that and thought about what it would mean to kind of sit in that space and think through, what the next 4 years will be like. So we found ourselves in this strange moment because, it's increasingly looking like the Electoral College will go to Biden. And so then the question becomes, how can we still feel exactly the same way we did 4 years ago when, Trump won? So that was the kind of, space that we were in. And it made me think a lot about ordinary or everyday fascism. And that's something that I'm just trying to think about in terms of a project and a chapter for this collection that really talks about the Black Panther Party. And also makes connections between the kind of surveillance and spying on the Black Panther Party that is then translated post 9/11 to Muslim communities in the tri-state area. So, that's sort of what I'm trying to do here. And I want to sort of start by thinking about the fact that, and this is mostly to answer the question that was posed about the analytic of fascism. What does it offer or obscure from view? I want to think about the ways in which a model of fascism that is, emerges in terms of Europe and then moves or is deployed in other places, how that obscures a longer history, I guess you would say, of fascism. And also, I think maybe obscures the ways in which this kind of neat totality that, if you just go to Wikipedia or wherever, authoritarianism, one-party state, nationalism, et cetera, things that we're very kind of familiar with when we think about fascism. I think that the US context allows us ways of thinking about how they're kind of overlapping and shifting sorts of structures and phenomena that don't necessarily always line up in the way that we maybe traditionally have thought about them, or historically anyway, thought about them. All right, and so in terms of thinking about what fascism might make visible, it seems to me that, as others have said just here today, it helps us think about the kind of rhetorical and visual strategies that are deployed by Trump in this moment, or by fascists more generally. It helps us think about how rhetorical and visual strategies might be, linked to earlier moments. So, for example, fake news becoming, something that we hear all the time deployed when people don't like the opinion or facts that you're presenting. You could think of the image of Trump standing on the White House balcony after he returned from Walter Reed Medical Center, trying to project an image of strength, in quotes. You could think about the refusal to wear a mask as a sign of weakness, or a sign of masculinity or weakness if one wears a mask. So you could think about all of those kinds of rhetorical and visual moves as ways of thinking about the kind of mainstreaming of a certain kind of fascist set of strategies. I think you can also think a bit about the kind of populism in Latin America. In particular, populism and fascism often go hand in hand. And unlike in the kind of US context, where most often we say that, fascism is a right-wing phenomena, my husband, who's a historian of Latin America, will tell me, no, fascism is a kind of all takers, an equal opportunity discourse and set of strategies. And it's not the case that the left has also been able to use it to mobilize in particular ways. So the thing that I want to kind of hone in on, though, is that when we talk about fascism and we have debates about, well, does the US count and how does it count and how is it different? It again kind of reinscribes the issue. It reinscribes the US as somehow exceptional. So it's a different kind of exceptionality, but it is still an exceptionality. And what I think the Black radical tradition offers us is a way of thinking about fascism as an everyday fascism, or as a kind of everyday experience that, I want to think about actually in relationship to our first presentation, in thinking about what does it mean to live in a country, in a context where we're still at the point where the truth isn't hidden and the truth doesn't matter. So it's not like we just got there. It's that in relationship to, Black communities, and one could say Native communities, there is knowledge and kind of erasure and forgetting all at the same time. And there's even kind of an ability to think about how things that objectively appear to be one way are actually another way. So the way that I often like to think about this is in these police encounters where they murder unarmed people, there's always this kind of interpretive dance that happens where, one community sees it as kind of blatant, murder. Another community says, well, this could have meant something else, and this could have been this, and so on and so forth. And it just takes these kind of absurd extremes because there is this kind of desire to constantly describe what one is seeing as not actually what one is seeing. And so what I guess I want to talk a little bit about is what if you think about anti-Black racism, and particularly the kind of tradition of Black radicalism that talks about, the period of Reconstruction and its failure as one kind of moment where fascism emerges, and then think about a sort of another moment or incarnation of it during the Jim Crow era. Think about it, another in the kind of post-Bash to civil rights moment that we have been in for quite a long time. In other words, what if you think about it as both these kind of discrete events or discrete historical periods, but that have a long thread that is absolutely denied by those who would talk about fascism. It's absolutely erased. So this kind of unexceptional or ordinary fascism is something that I'm just interested in thinking more about. In the US, Black populations, I think it's no surprise to anyone who's on this call, are treated as disposable, relegated to conditions defined by rampant discrimination and state violence, while being targeted as enemies of the state, and those responsible for the downfall or loss of privilege and prestige in another group. In other places, I've written about why it is that that Trump has been so startling for a certain segment of people, right? Why he's been seen to be exceptional, why there's been this kind of mock, I would call it, I guess, sense of surprise that he is being supported by an entire architecture, of the Republican Party and the political system more broadly. These kinds of questions emerge, but in fact, if you access a longer history, it becomes quite clear that that's kind of an everyday, white supremacy, use of state terrorism, arguing that you don't see what you actually think, arguing that the person who's the victim is actually the criminal, those kinds of basic strategies, which, we're very used to thinking about in terms of anti-Black racism in the US, are, also have their resonances with fascism, but also are not particularly new. What is new, and this is one of the arguments that I make in thinking about the post-civil rights moment, I think what is new is the way in which a language of civil rights, a language of discourse about being disenfranchised has been mobilized so successfully to describe white people. And then also in interesting ways to scapegoat the white working class as if they are the ones who are, supporters of this kind of move towards fascism, as opposed to, a larger movement of white people, right? And a screen behind which they kind of hide. So I think the Black radical tradition offers us a different genealogy of fascism's origins and development. It recontextualizes and expands what we describe as fascism, and also anti-fascism, right? What counts as anti-fascist? Does it have to be a movement? What does a movement look like? Who are the kind of historical actors we recognize doing that work, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it also allows us to see the creation of an other as a kind of necessary, though obviously not sufficient, strategy. And also the ways in which others are, or can be anyway, interchangeable, right? They don't have to be particularly, you don't have to use different strategies to target different communities. I guess that's the way I would put it most simply. And so I want to read just a little bit from the essay from the collection, because I think it sort of makes this point in a way that I can't, in this presentation do nearly as well. In 2012, the Associated Press published a series of articles on the New York City Police Department's decade-long spying on Muslim communities. The series told of police officers infiltrating college campuses, local cafes, grocery stores, community centers, and even mosques, stirring public outrage. So then we had congressional hearings and eventually a Pulitzer Prize for the two reporters who, in quotes, broke the story. As with so much of the media coverage of the so-called war on terror, the prevailing narrative seemed to be that this program was unprecedented, an anomaly. It was simply an unfortunate case of NYPD's overzealous policing after 9/11. The kind of alibi that it was a particular moment of hysteria that, George W. Bush somehow, took advantage of, but that in fact, it wasn't built upon a larger kind of structure and architecture, was one that you saw very quickly being deployed to think about this spying program. But contrary to popular belief, the targets were new, but the tactics were not. Covert spying on racialized communities did not emerge in the wake of the 2001 terror attacks. Rather, it originated much earlier, in this essay, in the NYPD's war on Black radicals and ghetto communities in the 1960s and 1970s. In both cases, the operation's primary tactics included warrantless surveillance, the use of agent provocateurs who supplied the weapons and targets to unwitting co-conspirators, right? So you supply, a weapon or a connection to, a weapon or a target, and then you say, well, actually, this person's idea would have come to life even without me, right? So that's the kind of way it plays itself out. What was different, however, was the length and scope of the operation to catch Muslim terrorists. First of all, it spanned 3 states. It involved dozens of officers and countless locations in a 10 years long fruitless search. So the end result of all of the resources that went into this and all of the tech and all of the violating of basic human rights resulted in not one identification of any threat. So 10 years of this kind of foolish and racist quest. The NYPD allocated to itself surveillance powers during that 10 years that exceeded that of the FBI. And in fact, the FBI at the time sort of looked on, in some ways, in a kind of bemused way, like, how did they get away with this stuff when, we have to go through the courts and we have to get surveillance warrants and so on. The Muslim operation coincided with considerable technological advances and the increasing militarization of the police that had been ongoing in terms of SWAT units, for example, since the 1960s, serving as a cautionary tale of what happens when the lifting of restraints and civilian oversight combined with state-of-the-art devices and techniques allow police to exceed jurisdictional boundaries and legal parameters in pursuing their racist profiling of communities as inherently suspect and dangerous. Just as the campaign against the Black Panther Party paved the way for the 2001 operation, so too did the latter operation pave the way for the increasing use of surveillance technologies and perhaps more importantly, a prevailing view on the part of police that they, and not actually, that's not quite right, not prevailing view, but both view and articulation, that they protect the interests of the state, even or perhaps especially if that interest includes the maintenance of anti-Black systemic racism. So again, if we want to think about the kind of shock and surprise that the media constantly performs around daily acts of police terror and violence, you could think about the protests this summer and the kind of scenes of police officers beating protesters, disappearing them into vans, et cetera. And so the essay tries to think about the relationship of the two in terms of thinking about both why this kind of historical knowledge of the kinds of activities that NYPD did in an earlier moment never seemed to kind of intersect with the, in quotes, discovery of this 2001 operation. And I think there are a lot of reasons why that's true, but I do think one of them has to do with parallel but not always overlapping social movements around, contesting Islamophobia, contesting a certain kind of racism that is very much marked by both skin tone and religion, as opposed to anti-Black racist kind of organizing and the ways in which those have not always easily sat alongside one another. But I think there's also something to be said for, or ways that we need to be thinking about how these strategies, in fact, and I guess this is related to the point I just made, in fact, do create opportunities for solidarity rather than thinking about them as kind of singular in a way that puts the kind of emphasis on strategies of reconciliation or strategies of redress or seeking of justice that, kind of splinter us further as opposed to sort of bringing us closer together. So the essay, in a sense, tries to think about that longer genealogy in terms of the Black Panther Party. And in work I still have to do, I want to also think about the conference and the United Front Against Fascism that emerges in the late 60s and why that was a vocabulary that was of use to the Black Panther Party and 5,000 other people during that moment. So thank you.
Thank you so much. These were amazing presentations. And so one of the things I would like to do is just to really open the venue to the panelists and see if any of you would like to respond to each other's presentations. And then from there, or in the meantime, encourage our audience to please take advantage of the Q&A function, and we'll be able to pose questions directly to the panelists through there.
I think, as I alluded to, but maybe could articulate differently, I was really struck by Professor Abu's presentation when they asked to think about why reclassify something that's so widely known. Why would that be a gesture that you would need to, make? And what thinking about is, what if it's widely known, but it's widely known, but it doesn't need to be reclassified because the knowledge doesn't provoke action, et cetera, which is sort of the place that, in some ways, I guess maybe you're getting to. But I sort of thought about, well, what if we started there, in terms of, anti-Black violence and the kind of constant repetition of surprise and outrage, the constant repetition of, surprise that the officers get off, the valuing of a wall over a person who's killed, et cetera. Like, what if that isn't something that really needs to even be reclassified? It's not even that significant. That's an important thing, I think, to think about for me in terms of knowledge and justice.
Right. I mean, if I can come in on that, because I was also thinking about what you were saying about how one displaces onto the working class, right? I think that's exactly right. And that's sort of the point. It's sort of the conundrum of why bother? And there was this sort of panic in the state that somehow it mattered. This is like so it's post 2000, it's after the second Intifada begins. But in fact, it's a misrecognition, I think, of the reality that it doesn't matter. And I actually think your sort of discussion of, obviously, what people see when they see police shoot is really important. But I also think it's almost what you were saying, what does it mean to live with people who don't regard to eliminate us? It's that there is also some level in which, whether one says it or not, one has to think about the question of, but I don't care. Yes, it is what it is, but I don't care. And I just want to say one other thing, because it really struck me when you were talking about also like blaming the white working class. I mean, the thing that really interested me about thinking about that weird incident, which is ongoing in Israel, by the way, and that Masco also traces in the book, they're reclassifying all this stuff you can literally download on the internet about weaponry. So what's going on? But that it's exactly that. It's the kind of supposedly liberal, the Ashkenazi liberal elite, right? So on the one hand, and it's true in terms of the reception here, it was the same. It was kind of the liberal American Jewish community, that there was some performance of recognition that was really important to producing themselves as ethical persons, right? Political consequences. It didn't mean anything had to be done to correct some of Israeli society, either on the religious settlers or Mizrahi. I'll use that word, which really is the structure. But there was no choice, does its own political work and kind of excuses. It makes you not the fascist or you not the racist, right? Because you suffer for it, but you still get to displace, right?
Yeah.
And there is something parallel going on with the white working class, right, in this country in terms of where is white supremacy.
Right. Yeah. And the kind of, I've been interested in just the Hillbilly Elegy thing that's on Netflix, which was just part of this whole movement of books that really tried to racialize rural whites in the ways that they had done so with Black people, right? So a kind of culture of poverty, and they're dysfunctional. And sometimes you just have to cut loose people because they're not able to help themselves. Like all of that kind of discourse really seemed to be sort of in fashion the first year after Trump was elected, as they sort of did this like, oh, we need to go talk to these people who aren't in, elite cities with lots of cafes or whatever. And that became a kind of, I think, absolutely a way of exonerating other white people and acting as if, there are enough rural white Americans to, carry an election, which there are not. So yeah, that's right.
I just wanted to say just to kind of continue on that same point. It seems like also there's the importance of a kind of both and, right? The way in which it's not simply disavowal that's at work. and that the way in which there is actually a mobilization of a certain kind of desire. It's a desire, I think, also that aligns with capital in a particular way. That is not just, it's not only disposability of those who are kind of racialized as other, or, you know, kind of the way in which, say, for Palestinians or for Black folks, that, that there is a continual process of making violable, making there to be violated, that is actually really constituent, that's really important. And it's not so much about the sort of always the killing of, but as the perpetual making available to be killed. That it seems to me that, and that aligns with Cynthia, what you were talking about at the beginning of sort of like, what does it mean when we encounter people in our daily lives every day that, you know, hold these views. And I wonder if that kind of, how to speak with both you, well, actually with all the presentations about what it means to kind of hold in place those two things simultaneously, a sort of knowing, unknowing, and that is actually about a certain desire and kind of hatred, the kind of enmeshing of desire and hatred in the same kind of way. I don't know if that sort of elicits further commentary, but that's what comes to my mind in terms of some of the commentaries.
Well, I do think this is sort of maybe parallel, not necessarily intersecting with the point you're making, but to go back to this living alongside people who would see you annihilated, I think that it's so interesting to me, and I wouldn't have known this had I not lived in central PA in this particular historical moment. It's very interesting to me the way in which people are trying to kind of perform at multiple registers, different. So so it's not as predictable as like, oh, the person with the Trump thing is mean to me or like gives me the eye or whatever. Sometimes it's like the opposite. It's like the Trump person is like, hey, so that they can, you know, say it's not about that, right? So it's also like just so many different weird permutations, and also just a lot of articulating of white power as a necessary corrective to having been disenfranchised, which I mean, the last time I saw that was, 1991 South Africa. So it's just so interesting to me because I'm like, wow, so I don't know if people have seen this where they are, but where we are, there are these Trump flags, and what they say is sick of the bullshit. And it's like, first of all, what does that even mean? Because it's the second term. So like, is the bullshit before it? Like, it's totally unclear what it is, but it just shows this kind of free range anger that can get mobilized onto basically anything and everything, right? And these kinds of wars, which we see, which we find amusing, between like the Black Lives Matter posters in people's windows and the Trump posters in people's windows. So like, and there'll be a proliferations, there'll be 4, and then there's 5 of the other persons, all of that kind of just sort of jockeying, but also this kind of performing of not being racist, not anti, but just, no, it's not about that. It's about my rights, right? My freedom or whatever.
Before we begin to get into the Q&A, I just want to kind of quickly just say something, because I was so struck by what at least a kind of common thread was a kind of a certain breakdown in the concept of civil society. I mean, this was a question that one of our panelists from the first panel, Alan Lumba, talked about in the context of the Philippines. And to kind of talk about in the Philippines that there is no such thing as civil society, right? And I think this links to the idea that Cynthia brought up about ordinary fascism, right? Or that the civil society is part of the mechanism by which ordinary fascism proliferates, right? I think especially if you think about it in the context of anti-Black racism, and even in the context of anti-Indigenous cruelty, and then the kind of perennial scapegoating of different migrant formations. I'm reminded, I saw this really fascinating book talk by my colleague here at NYU, Cristina Beltran, whose new book is kind of on the white democracy and the ways in which migrant suffering sustains white democracy. And she really reframed white democracy as a participatory structure, right? I think we think of it as a kind of like structure that's about repression and exclusion and irrationality, but there is something fundamentally participatory about that, the structure of power. And it made me think of both the ways in which a certain breakdown in civil society speaks to Nadia's, the conundrum that Nadia pointed out, right? In the sense that, you know, it is like at once public, it is in a newspaper, but it has to be classified, and that nullifies a certain kind of critical response that we would have, right? That nullifies the kind of way in which we think of critical or civil society as some sort of space for some sort of critical practice, right? It might be, you know, the paradigmatic venue to speak truth to power, right? And so in that breakdown, right, I'm kind of really struck by what Maka brought up about like fascism as being, you know, persistently about dulling your thought and overwhelming your senses, right? And so yeah, I don't know, I just thought that there's something about the interplay between this kind of breakdown of civil society and the ways in which it, you know, it might be a breakdown for a certain liberal framework, right? But I think when we begin to think about the historic everydayness of fascist brutality, right, we see a different kind of function to civil society, one that is about masquerading or kind of, not masquerading, but kind of like rendering rational or acceptable a series of encoded or explicit violences. So I just wanted to throw it out there because it's something that
Say a few words about that and just, oh, Maka, no, go ahead, Maka. I was going to say, because I think like your talk about Latin America is also really important. The idea that this doesn't start with Trump. I mean, not just that it doesn't start with Trump, but what the models for these different iterations, you know, have long histories in Latin America too, some of which are more junta-like and some of which are more, at least presumptively democratic. And then the question, and I'll just be quiet, Cynthia, what you're talking about, and the whole idea of the kind of racial fascism of American society was never the kind of fascism of which Hannah Arendt wrote, right? It always had this civil society, this democratic element, which required precisely the participation and the active participation. So it might dull thinking in certain ways, but it's not about censorship and the kind of lying, organized lying that Arendt talked about. And I think we really have to think about that being a very different, I mean, and that's true in Israel.
In some ways, I think you're raising, many of you, some of the questions I have about using the term fascism writ large and using it in these different applications versus other kinds of naming of authoritarian and vertical power and both repressive productive power and forms of organizing colonial racial orders, you know, and I keep going back to that because I think the decolonial move would say, well, fascism is a kind of terminology of European modernity and doesn't really speak to the kind of longer 15th century formations of something like, you know, deep structures of racial authoritarianism. I mean, I think that was one of the points I was trying to make, but I love what, you know, you all are discussing in some ways, the, you know, Cynthia's point about ordinary fascisms, or this idea that Aloysia, I think you're referring to, of a kind of affective structure that we have to think about, like what is the structure of affect of this, you know, not just this present moment, but maybe fascisms. And the point about collusion, cooperation, complicity, you know, living with the neighbor that is the kind of, you know, the white nationalist or the torturer, or, you know, in all those ways, in those textures of societies, post-authoritarian societies in the Latin American context, where, you know, the torture survivor lives with the torturer right there walking in the streets, and what it means to actually share space. And, you know, of course, this is a broad problem for societies, but I think it's something that, you know, there's certainly a kind of liberal form of redress that has been put into motion in the global vocabularies of, you know, redress after a certain kind of human rights violations. But can we think about something that's deeply accountable? Because I think one of the reasons potentially that this moment feels so bad, to go back to Cynthia's opening, is what's going to happen with good old Trump? You know, does he just get off the hook? What are the structures of accountability and radical accountability and communal, you know, radical forms of justice? I don't know exactly how to put it, that actually require us to push beyond just like business as usual, or this kind of normative political kind of you know, it won't be normative in any sense, but still will be normative enough, you know, where there won't be a finer point put on accountability.
Yeah.
Right, and for all the senators that get reelected, and if Trump loses, will now pretend they were never like actively complicit. They're going to reconstruct themselves as like pre-Trump Republicans, right? There was no accountability.
So we have a question from an audience member. I will go ahead and copy and paste it into the chat just so it can be seen, but I'll read it aloud as well. Thank you to every panelist for their work and comments. I have a question for Macarena Gomez Baris. Could you elaborate on the interplay between the move toward or resurgence of authoritarian capitalism and what you called, quote unquote, the end of ontology? Specifically, if the ghost of authoritarianism has been hidden, quote unquote, within neoliberalism and other formations and systems in its longue durée, then what kind of ontology or grammar of self/collective emerges and disappears here and now as we engage in horizontal redress or alongside this ghost?
Well, that's a wonderful comment, along as a kind of question. And I mean, I think the kind of theoretical point that I was trying to make, and I played with the idea of contra-ontology or counter forms of ontology to go back to the kind of Western, you know, philosophical moment that is like been ruptured, but then is constantly trying to be reproduced again. And that is, I think, I mean, the move to resurgent authoritarian capitalism is different in that I think it's a kind of moment of political economy, as I was suggesting, you know, and I'm trying to work it out for this essay, but I think part of the complication is that you have this political formation where liberal democracies say, in many, I'll use again the case of Latin American states and its transition to democracy, just actually embedded within it a kind of lack of an ongoing transition to neoliberalism, as if the desaparecidos weren't the very fodder for this new model of economic production. And above, you know, upon the broken bodies, upon the torture victims, upon exiles, etc., those that expelled, is precisely the kind of new model is born of this kind of privatization, deregulation, everything we understand to be neoliberalism. But I think what I'm trying to suggest in the paper, and I haven't quite gotten there, and I'm really looking forward to reader reports and editorial advice on this, is, you know, are we really seeing the kind of shadow effects of the end of one political economic model and on to something else? Everyone keeps talking about this transitional economic moment of globalization, but we're not really naming its authoritarian character. And the fact that, in fact, to expel such large parts of the population, to criminalize ever expanding groups, right, that are being dispossessed, and the economies of dispossession, to cite the social text issue that Alosha participated in, it, you know, what does that require? And it requires this vertical form of power. It requires, you know, if we call it neo-fascism, et cetera. So that's what I'm trying to get at. That's the ghost or the haunt that I'm trying to get at in this paper. And so far, semi-successfully, but that, I think that's part of the work of polishing. So thank you for the question.
Let's see.
Do you want to pull up the Google Doc?
Yeah, I'm pulling them now. So there's one question that I think this is for everyone. If we can say more about, or the panelists can say more about the appearance of similarity / interchangeability of ordinary fascist discourses used by the right and left in constructing the other, and relatedly, the deployment of outrage, resentment, and or pride related to national, ethnic, national racial identities by polarized partisan groups. So this is a question that's specifically building on the question of affective structures. I can, I'll copy and paste it in the chat.
Well, I mean, some of the similarities I think do have to do with conjuring a harm to a group that has demonstrably not been harmed and is in fact harmed people, and sort of flipping it on its head, right? So I think that part of, at least in terms of anti-Black racism, this idea that now, whites are this disenfranchised minority, as they hurtle towards demographic interchange, et cetera. And so the ways in which they are able to mobilize and talk about themselves as kind of the new civil rights, protesters, right? Like the new bearers of this tradition that, is kind of one of the main ways that we talk about rights in the US. It seems to always go back to, the civil rights movement. And so I think having access to that discourse is really, really important. But I also think it's about the kind of claim to be a populist, right? In the face of absolute, wealthy elites and huge corporations who are benefiting at the same time as they are calling out, doing a kind of playbook of populism. And the way I like to think about it is, Trump's base doesn't care that he only paid $750 in taxes in 2017, I guess it was. They don't care about that. And part of the reason they don't care about that is that they somehow link the American dream to it, right? Like everyone wants to only have to pay, right? So it becomes like, they all wish they were me, but they're not all as smart as me, et cetera. Like that's the way he spends it. But I also think that, one of the kind of most disheartening things that I've seen living in Central PA is as the pandemic has taken hold, and our kids were out of school for months and months, like everybody else's, the huge, food lines of these, white rural people. It's not the Black people who live in State College who are in that line, because most of us are employed by Penn State and we have some kind of job security right now. So even just, I was talking to my friend and I was saying, I need to donate more to the food bank. And she was like, oh no, I told Jim he can't do it. He literally can't do it. Fuck those people because they're voting to annihilate us and I'm not going to feed them, And so it was just like this moment where I thought like, wow, like seriously, don't mess with her. But also like that there's something about the way in which their own disadvantage is always being, played onto the other and never respond, the responsibility of anyone who actually could do something about it, right? It's just kind of, there's just so many like everyday examples that are so both odd and kind of heart-wrenching in this moment.
If I can just piggyback on that. It's really interesting. I think the thing that really has struck me and that we sort of people who are on the left or consider themselves on the left really need to struggle with is that it's almost like what began as a kind of radical civil rights politics has become almost a form that has circulated in ways and been appropriated by groups for which it was never intended. And more than that, it's almost the only available form of the political in the US today, right?
Yeah.
So in the work I've been doing on this book, whatever, it's a very complicated thing, is what's really striking to me, for example, is there's this, this massive conversation publicly about the so-called civilian military divide, right? The language about soldiers and often by soldiers and veterans itself is almost producing the military as its own identity group. There's a resentment towards civilians, right? There's a kind of, without any of the critical politics that identity politics, at least initially put forth, that same grammar structures a lot of this conversation. You could see it in John Kelly's disastrous, remember, I don't know, a year and a half ago that he did this press conference in defense of Trump, who'd insulted the wife, who'd said to the wife of a soldier killed in Niger, well, he knew what he was getting into. And at the end of like this total defense, I mean, he both talked about, which actually comes out a lot, that the military is the other 1%, the only people who serve.
Yep.
He did this whole thing about, and at the end, he was, these people are better than anyone else. They go in and serve at a time where nobody thinks that's worthwhile. And at the end of the press conference, only said he would take questions, but only from people in the military or who were families from people who knew. Like there's this, again, like digging into a form of a grammar of politics that is now doing work that is anything but that is anything but critical or counter hegemonic, because it's almost like this floating form that is the only imaginary of politics in American society. And I'll tell you one last thing. It really struck me even when the Occupy Wall Street movement happened. I had an undergraduate who was writing a thesis on it, and she just read it as a kind of identity politics. And I was like, no. Let's think about class here, right? But she couldn't read it in any other way but that as a kind of middle class identity. And I think we have to really think about that, because this sentiment is what drives, and identity is what drives this political debate. There's not an equivalence between the right and the left, and between groups who really are marginalized and those who one might want to argue otherwise. But I'm not sure it's productive as a political grammar anymore, because everyone's appropriated it, for one thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think this point about the military, I mean, I just think about the fact that, we have centers for gender equity, we have centers, for race inequality, and we have a center for veterans. And the way in which they are very much lumped into this, disenfranchisement or alienation on campus, et cetera, a feeling that, or discrimination, right, that's even used, I think is really, has always struck me as very odd. But also, our local police department, if you are a veteran, you go to the top of the line to get that position. It doesn't matter how you score on your test. It doesn't matter how, where you would be ranked or where you came into the line. And that's like some state law, right? So, there's this so-called liberal little bubble in State College, allegedly. And then there's, the police who behave in the way that armies do in occupied territories in some ways.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. And then after this will be the last, and we'll conclude. But there's a question from Hillary Whitman Sanchez, and I'll just go and read it and then post it. And it's about, let me go and post it. Thank you to all the presenters for sharing their work with us. I'd like to return to one of the functions of knowledge and fascism as a practice that I identified in my remarks, namely the suppression of both academic and subaltern knowledge. And the question is hoping that the panelists can speak about the potential and limits of academia as an institution for guarding and fostering a variety of forms of knowledge.
Thank you for that question. Maybe I'll take a first effort at. I mean, I think, academia is, if we're talking about vertical institutions, in forms of power, like the church and the military and academia are the ones that are organized in such a kind of hierarchical structure. And I think there is a kind of desire to, not to overuse this term, but to decolonize academic institutions, and especially given the kind of forms of labor and practices, contingent labor, et cetera, visiting professorships, adjuncts, et cetera. And I think, it's a really important discussion for us to have. And I wrote The Extractive Zone, and it took me a long time to kind of catalog these forms of ongoing colonial and persistent power and the kind of social texture as forms of resistance and refusal in the face of that upon indigenous territories. And what I'm working on now is really thinking about not only to kind of document extractive zones, but think about kind of non-extractive relations. Like what did those look like? You know, what would it mean to kind of reorganize knowledge so that it was both non-extractive and had different forms of engendering the kinds of horizontal and participatory, you know, resource sharing that we know is sometimes centralized in spaces like academia. So I think that is just beginning to think about, you know, I don't want to suggest it's a kind of limit. It certainly is an institution, because we're at a moment, right, where academia, public museums, all these spaces are under attack, and finding ourselves again in defense of the very thing that we've always been is suggesting limits. But I think these ways of kind of rethinking inside outside, forming alliances, thinking about thinkers, makers, artists, doers together, you know, kind of these strategic forms of knowledge production that both valorize differently, so vernacular knowledge or other forms of knowing, knowledge otherwise are pretty central, but at the same time, you know, kind of don't dissemble the institution in this very moment that it's being destroyed for us.
Mhm. Well, I was just thinking about the irony. This never happens to me, but of being on a panel with scholars who are also administrators. So these are questions we think about all the time in terms of how do you, you know, make space for different kinds of knowledges? How do you make space for different kinds of thinkers who write and talk in different ways, you know, et cetera. Like these are just things that we're always sort of thinking about. And, you know, recently for me, it's been, you know, having done, we just did a large cluster hire of 13 people. We just got a new dean who is Black and in African-American studies. So it's been kind of this moment of relearning those lessons of how, you know, race and ethnic studies generally has been deployed in some contexts as a kind of cover, right? And so there's this way in which, you know, the institution can congratulate itself at the same time as when the kind of rubber hits the road in terms of critiques, they want nothing to do with it, right? Like, so it's like that constant, you know, just thinking about the scholar strike that just happened. Like my dean and I got into it over it because I said I'm doing it, and I'd written a little, you know, thing to the public, whatever that might mean in central state, you know, central PA. And his argument came down to this kind of, I totally support this. I think this is a great thing, but administrators are not the same thing as, you know, workers. Like they can't just strike in the same way. And I was like, I didn't sign anything that said that. Like, I understand that that's maybe the popular way of thinking about certain kinds. So it's just, I do think that some of these pitched battles around opening up spaces are going to more and more, you know, be a kind of multicultural, liberal and or right-wing, you know, contingent as, you know, we have gained some space. I think those kinds of questions are going to keep coming up, even just thinking about, you know, the question of tenure standards. Like I found actually more people who are in African-American studies who actually don't support this idea that we would do any kind of community research or public facing, you know, kinds of activities, and that those would be equivalent to, you know, so they literally have had people make arguments to me like, well, yeah, she had a Washington Post op-ed, and this is not me, it's one of my faculty. And that has impact, but not the same kind of impact as if she published in this journal that like 10 people read. And it's just like, that's not sustainable. You surely see that that's not a kind of sustainable way of thinking, but I do think that maybe they don't. And maybe it's going to be a long battle.
I think that's such an important point that you're raising, and it cuts in so many ways, because if you think about the UK model, you know, in its kind of dismantling of public education, one of the instrumental forms that have emerged are this way of documenting and counting for public event, for attendees, for
Yeah.
all kinds of forms of public intellectual
Yeah.
production. And
Mhm.
it's been a nightmare there,
Yeah,
as we know
right.
from our colleagues, right? So the kinds of, you know, pressures that come down, I mean, I think we have to be very careful what we say
Yeah.
and how we do it, depending on administrator top-down kind of exigencies versus our own political modes of engagement that
Mhm.
we might think about differently. So it's something we're doing a lot and trying to think about it at Global South Center. So your comment just made me really, really think about that further. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a really important point, and I like what it's making me think about, because I had been thinking, well, you know, just like there can be different metrics, but I think the metrics obviously are the problem too, because, you know, that's, this counts, that doesn't, you know, this many people it gets in and this many people it doesn't, like all of that. And at Penn State, we have to do that for all of our activities. We have to say how many people were there in the audience, you know, how many people were invited and how many people showed. Like, it's actually like a document that replaces our CV and is just like these different fields. And there's no room to put things, well, there's like one little section, but you can't really put things you're working on. Like, it's a very kind of, you know, some crazy algorithm. And that's how our tenure dossier and promotion dossier gets, you know, organized.
Nadia, were you about to, it looked like you were going to say something?
I was, but I think I sort of lost the thread. I mean, yeah, I think you guys have sort of covered the parameters of the problem. I mean, let me just say one thing, but the other piece, I mean, the struggle within the academy in terms of who gets hired, what kinds of projects. I mean, as an anthro department at Columbia, we're also, you know, struggling a little bit with trying to open up the question of what would count as a good dissertation, right? I mean, we're so theory driven. And so, you know, there was people come in with these great projects, but in some ways they end up feeling marginalized because there's at least some people who don't think, you know, whatever, you can imagine. But so there are all sorts of things like that. But I have to say, you know, this, even what I was talking about today, I also struggle more substantively with, I mean, I think about now the 30 years now of scholarship on Palestine and Israel, and there was sort of this hope that, you know, when the post-Zionist stuff came out, it wasn't that it was new. I mean, Palestinians had known this and been writing about this for decades, but suddenly people were listening, right? And there's this incredible, you know, proliferating scholarship on Palestine, largely also now, not just by Israelis, but obviously by Palestinians themselves, that to sort of to tell this other history and to imagine and otherwise, but you know, the archive has held this kind of space of promise in post-colonial studies. And I've sort of been really sort of last year or two, maybe it's just like a moment in time, but it hasn't made a difference, right? I mean, politically, it doesn't make a difference. We write, we founded a whole center at Columbia. We do really interesting work. We have interesting conversations. But the idea that which really would count as the kind of subaltern suppressed knowledge has made a difference in the world, it's harder and harder to sustain. I mean, and then I think, okay, things are, but I think that is my struggle. So what difference, like, there was a kind of a belief that if one could sort of get a different story out there, tell a different history, that it has political power. And, you know, to some extent, of course, the conversation on Palestine has changed in the US or what else, but the realities on the ground have only gotten worse, right? And I do think it's something I struggle with. Like, I don't know what one does with that, because that's what we do, right? But I don't know. So I don't want to end on that note. I still do it. I still write these books and I really think they're important. I'm working on it, right? But I think it requires some, I don't know. I think there does require, I'm trying to think about, but how do we torque it in a slightly different way? Because I feel like I'm hitting a wall in some profound ways.
I think in some ways it goes back though to what you were saying, the idea that, so the kind of notion of the liberal notion of exposure, of visibility as being this sort of fundamental axis of political transformation is at best a misleading kind of structure of or enticing promise. And that actually, so the political work that you're describing, that different forms of knowledge production, writing, storytelling, art practices does, might not be one that that speaks to this sort of fictional general audience and has these massive transformation politically in that way, but it does actually organize people in relationship to each other who are engaged in pursuing that transformation. So I think actually the sort of positive point to end on is that actually it's through thinking of it differently, not as something kind of going out to an audience that is somehow doesn't yet know but will be transformed by. Instead, thinking about it's the conversations through people who are already engaged in those struggles and making connections across different struggles that we actually get to certain different kinds of value in sharing knowledge, thinking, different kinds of artistic practices. I would say that gets away from the sort of like making visible, exposing, the sort of the truth that is, if people only knew, then they would do things differently. And I think that the point of what all the panelists you've all spoken to is that, like, that's just not true. People are not suddenly radicalized by the thing they never knew, because oftentimes they knew it anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the way you often see this play out in Black studies is that you'll go to a talk by a white scholar and they'll talk about like the unique brutality of Reconstruction, or like like it was so brutal. And everyone acts like it's the first time they've ever heard that. And then you kind of think back to yourself, you're like, Du Bois, you like go through the list of all the people who were not white who've said this. And so there's a constant kind of like surprise forgetting that like constantly goes on. And then like maybe even that person's lauded, like, oh my God, this is such brave and like, boundary breaking work. And then, it's still, that doesn't make any difference either, but they kind of acknowledge it in a different sort of way. So, I mean, I think Alyosha is absolutely right. And that's actually the note that we ended on in this meeting of like 30 people. It was like, we put our faith in the people who are doing the organizing and the working, and we consider ourselves to be part of that. And that's what's gonna change. It's not the making it visible. And I've staked a lot of my career on that too. Like I'm not throwing stones. I'm just saying that like, it's a different way of thinking about how knowledge organizes change that I'm much more committed to, and I'm also just getting really committed to doing gritty work, like maybe running for the school board, like just stuff like that, because I'm just like, they are like punishing our Black boys, like you would just not, I mean you would believe obviously, but like 7 times, and they're like 10 of them or whatever it is. So it's like, I'm starting to think about those kinds of things, and it is kind of interesting when you take the knowledge that we have and the skills that we have, which are very specialized and very particular and not called for necessarily all the time, let's just say. It's very interesting when you put those into spaces where people don't expect it to be, because they all of a sudden are on their heels. That's not to say that like they change, I'm not saying that, but it's just, it changes the dynamic. I mean, so much so that it's just been kind of fascinating to watch. I mean, I think I would rather kill myself than be on a school board, but I am thinking like, in some ways, it's like, it's super important work, because they just talk to each other about how they're all liberal and it's great, and they just wish they knew what to do. And, it's just, it's madness. Anyway.
I mean, I just want to add to everything that you all are saying, and to go back to Nadia's question, and this, but the work on Palestine in the United States is inherently an epistemic space of doing all kinds of work, right? In the face of so many kind of dominant knowledge formations. And also to Alyosha's point, I mean, I think it depends on the kind of stretching that we do of academia. And I think the kind of work that's represented in this panel, we're always doing and wearing so many different hats, and we're, kind of stretching the kind of ivory tower, if you will. And there's also, I go back, if we're really taking seriously, like the kind of moment of European fascism, the kind of the birth of critical theory, right? In this moment of study in the 1930s and 1940s, and Horkheimer and Adorno and Benjamin, and the kind of importance, to go back to Cynthia's invocation of the Black radical tradition of study, right? And just of those kinds of spaces for relational ontologies. I mean, I like what Lau put also in the Q&A about the shadow effects of learning from those around us, right, and making connections. So I think that's a beautiful place to end as well, Lau. So thank you.
Yes, I didn't mean to be such a downer. It's just one of those days.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, what it means to sort of, to go back to Adorno, to how does one begin to imagine an otherwise? And we are at this very critical historical moment. And there are things that are shifting. I mean, for better and for worse. And I think that is really the project, to just keep at it in some ways until one can imagine an otherwise.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, we actually began the panel musing on our kind of either deep or mild despair. And so I think this is actually a kind of like fitting way to end it on a kind of cautiously optimistic, right, without being naive or blithe about it. But thank you to Nadia, Cynthia, and Maka for your brilliant contributions. I think we all are kind of much more kind of enriched in our intellects because of it. And I think that this is really going to make a kind of decisive contribution to the special issue. So thank you to all of our attendees, and to Christine and Neda as well for helping us organize these conversations. And yeah, hope everyone has a good night.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
everyone.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Meet
Bye,
again.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.